Hello, my name is John Smithin, and I'm the research director of the Aurora Philosophy Institute here in Aurora, Ontario, Canada. I would like to talk today about the topic being, essence, and existence. Uh, all three topics or terms are obviously very controversial topics in philosophy. And we're going to have a philosophy cafe. That's one of our regular meetings on this very topic in a few weeks' time, December the 14th, 2024. So what I'm doing here is just making a few preliminary notes to set up the discussion. So I want to start with a quote from Armand Moret, who says this: "Throughout the history of Western philosophy, from Parmenides to Heidegger, metaphysicians have tried to fathom the meaning of being. What does it mean to be or to exist? This is both the easiest and most difficult question to answer. Who can fail to know the existence or non-existence of the things that he experiences?" Well, that's a rhetorical question. As a matter of fact, there is an answer to that. The vast majority of philosophers claim that they do not know the existence or non-existence of the things that they experience. Anyway, Mora goes on: "At the same time, who would claim to have plumbed the depth of the meaning of existence?" Well, I would say the answer to that is a metaphysical realist, someone who subscribes to metaphysical realism. They do claim to have got to the bottom of this topic. Not every philosopher is sort of self-deprecating, if you will. I think that Mora should also mention, by the way, Sartre's book Being and Nothingness, one of the most famous existentialists. In any event, Mora goes on to say, "It is perhaps understandable that some modern philosophers have given up the inquiry into being." Here's the thing, though. Aristotle had thought that metaphysics was, this is a definition from Aristotle, a science which investigates being as being and the attributes which belong to this in virtue of its own nature. But Heidegger's book, Being and Time, in 1927, was hailed as the destruction, with a K, of metaphysics and the end of foundationalism. Also, I would say that Heidegger's attempted destruction was nothing new, even roughly 100 years ago. In the 18th century, for example, both Christian Wolff and Immanuel Kant had already made similar sorts of comments about the end of metaphysics, or at least serious problems with metaphysics that needed to be resolved. So this distrust of metaphysics is perennial. Heidegger presumably thought he had delivered the coup de grace, but was this so? Maybe what was going on was something like the process described by Etienne Gilson some decades after Heidegger. After defining metaphysics, this is what Gilson says, Aristotle was careful to add, "This is not the same thing as any of the so-called special sciences, for none of the others deals with being as being. They cut off a part of being and investigate the attributes of this part." Gilson continues, "To cut off a part of being and to investigate its attributes is a legitimate undertaking. It is one of the special sciences. But to invest any part of being with the attributes of being itself is that is to investigate the whole from the point of view of just a part involves a contradiction. Anybody who attempts it," and he's talking about all of these philosophers, Wolff, Kant, Heidegger, anybody who attempts it is bound to fail. When he fails, he will probably blame his failure on metaphysics itself and conclude that metaphysics is a pseudoscience. Now, Gilson was trying to promote the approach of St. Thomas Aquinas. He was a 20th century Thomist. And here is what he, Gilson, had to say on the specific topic of being. It may seem strange and almost preposterous to look back to the 13th century, that is, to look back to Aquinas, for a complete metaphysical interpretation of being, in which neither essence nor existence is irrelevant. Yet such a return is unavoidable. All other philosophies have advocated either a metaphysics of being minus existence or a phenomenology of existence minus being. A metaphysics of being minus existence was exactly what had been offered by the ancients, most of the scholastics, other than Aquinas, and by the moderns. The existentialists of the 20th century offered a phenomenology of existence minus being, phenomenology being a concept derived from Husserl. This, however, existence minus being, unsurprisingly, led to nausea, which was the title of one of Sartre's novels, anguish, absurdity, despair, and so on, all the mid-20th century feelings of angst and so on. Maybe we don't have to go all the way back to the 13th century. In the 21st century, there has been a so-called realist turn, as described, for example, by Rasmussen and Den Earl in a book from 2020. However, if we're to understand the argument and actually to suggest that metaphysical realism is an attractive option, it will be necessary to clarify in more detail what philosophers have meant by such terms as being, essence, and existence. Well, the obvious place to start is with the meaning of the word being itself. There are two uses of the word in the English language and in most other Indo-European languages. The first is a noun. We can speak of a human being or being itself. The second is as a verb, the present participle of the verb to be. And this in itself is a source of confusion. In the first sense, being is a thing. In the second, it is an action. And one mistake that philosophers seem to have made over the centuries is just to pick up on one or other of those meanings, ignoring the alternative. And this is not good. We need to take account of both senses of the term. We can also think about different senses of the word is. Is the third person singular of the verb to be. We can say, for example, that Socrates is a man. And here we are talking about what medieval philosophers called the quiddity, or the whatness of Socrates, quiddity from quid pro quo, it's Latin, the quiddity or whatness of Socrates, the kind of thing that Socrates is. And this is the basic idea of what, came to be called essence. Socrates is something. On the other hand, we could also simply say that Socrates is, with only two words in the sentence. We might fancy it up a bit by saying that Socrates is being, but this is redundant. What is at stake now is existence itself. The term essence is also connected linguistically with the verb to be, esse in Latin. Existence presumably derives from the Latin existentia. Now, the most natural way to think about being surely is that it must possess both quiddity and existence. A being should exist and it should be something. But philosophers through the ages, with very few exceptions, seem to have missed this. How did this come about? It goes all the way back to the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers. Parmenides, who lived from 515 to 450 BC, and Heraclitus, around 500 BC, who each took extreme and opposite metaphysical positions. These were roughly, on the one hand, that nothing ever changes, that was Parmenides, and on the other, that everything is always in flux, Heraclitus. And in the case of Heraclitus, if everything is always in flux, there's the implication that nothing much can be said about anything. We can never really know anything. Now, I'm sure that the natural reaction, again, to this is that both are wrong. But philosophers through the ages, from the beginning, have never seemed to be able to sort this out satisfactorily. The way that Gilson again has put it is that the most fundamental need of the human mind seems to be to reduce explanations of reality to just one thing or one cause. They're always trying to reduce it down to one thing. The ancient Greeks, for example, had this idea of the four different elements. Everyone knows about this: earth, air, fire, and water. But even before the time of Heraclitus and Parmenides, there had been theories which tried to reduce everything to just one of them, to water, to air, or to fire, and so forth. But this does not work for obvious reasons. The obvious reason is that even if you do that, water is not the same thing as air, and air is not the same thing as fire, right? Obviously. Parmenides therefore decided that being itself was the one thing that everything must have in common. Having taken this step, however, it then seems inevitable that he would proceed directly to one of these two metaphysical extremes. Now, to quote directly from Parmenides following Gilson, it is necessary that being either is absolutely or is not. It either is or is not. But if so, what happens to all the actual beings that are in existence at any point in time? They must somehow have come into being at one point, implying that they were not before. Then they fade away, implying that they're not going to be in the future. They are born and then they die, and so on. According to Parmenides, however, and many others, being just goes on forever. Now, we're all familiar with the way that the later Christians solved the problem. Yes, they would say people are indeed born and then they die. But these individuals are just a composite. They are not really real in some sense. They are composed of a material thing called a body and an immaterial thing called a soul, the latter of which is eternal. When the body dies, the soul just goes on its merry way. Even the body does not disappear entirely. It can always be recycled, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But the problem with this, of course, is that it radically devalues our own actual day-to-day existence and being, which is the only existence that we have any knowledge of. Gilson the Christian does, it seems to me, clearly see the problem that this poses for the pagan Parmenides and for most of subsequent philosophy, be it Christian or otherwise. And Gilson says, if we call existence that definite mode of being which belongs to the world of change, I personally exist. As given in sensible experience, it becomes obvious that there is a considerable difference between to be and to exist. And here's the problem. That which exists, me, is not. That which is, does not exist. This idea somewhere. From the beginning of Western thought, it appears that if being truly is, nothing should exist. There is nothing in being as such to account for the fact of existence. If there is such a thing as existence, either it is kept side by side in some way with being, something wholly unrelated to being, or else it will pass as what modern existentialists say, modern in Gilson's day, of course. The modern existentialists called it a disease of being, a disease of being. So Western philosophy took up this idea and ran with it. There's supposed to be some kind of theoretical blueprint somewhere, the essence of what it means to be a human or a horse or a tree or a stone. And this blueprint is what is really real. It is unchanging and perfect. Compared to this actual existence, including our own existence, does not add very much. Now, it was Plato from 428 to 348 BC who coined the term really real, and he had various names for the blueprint, such as the idea, the form, and so on. Plotinus, from 204 to 270 AD, the archetypal Neo-Platonist, continued this line of thought some centuries later, and then it was transmitted to the medieval scholastics other than Aquinas as the problem of universals. Aristotle himself, living from 384 to 322 BC, was ambiguous on the issue. In the 18th century, as late as that, Immanuel Kant came up with the notion of the noumenon, or thing in itself. I'm sure you've heard that expression, the thing in itself. Kant was the key figure in the so-called critique of knowledge. According to Kant, there is indeed a sort of reality, this noumenon, which is there behind the scenes, so to speak, and moreover, somehow outside space and time even, but humans can never have full access to it. This is the point, critique of knowledge. They cannot really know it. And so this obviously harks back all the way to the ideas of the likes of Parmenides and Plato. So I would say that it is no wonder that Heidegger and the existentialists would eventually reject this whole line of reasoning. Their own response, however, that of being as a disease, as we have just mentioned, is no sort of solution. It doesn't really solve the problem. The true solution would have to be one in which both senses of the term being, that as a noun, being as a noun, what something is, and that as a verb, an action, the act of existence in the world of change, both of those things have to be fully considered. Hence, ultimately, I would argue the necessity of metaphysical realism. Well, thank you very much. I hope that we in the API are going to have an interesting discussion, debate, argument about this in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you.